I guarded both brothers. William and Harry stopped speaking. Long before the public noticed. I knew them before the world decided what their bond meant. To the public, Prince William and Prince Harry were a single story told in two faces. The older brother steady and prepared. The younger brother vivid and unfiltered. After everything they lived through, people wanted to believe the two of them were unbreakable, not because it was true, but because it was comforting. Inside the palace, comfort is not a priority. Continuity is. I was assigned to their protection at different times, then to overlapping duties that placed me close enough to notice the shifts other people missed. In my work, the most important detail is never what is said out loud. It is what people stop saying when a certain person walks into the room. At first, their relationship looked exactly like the public imagined. There were quick glances that carried private jokes, small gestures that did not need explaining, a kind of ease that made the staff relax, because it reminded everyone that beneath the titles there were still two brothers who understood each other without effort. Then something changed, not in a single moment, but in a pattern. It began with timing. William started arriving a fraction earlier to formal engagements, as if he preferred the room settled before his brother entered. Harry began arriving a fraction later, as if he wanted to avoid the quiet process that happens when the palace takes control of a space. They still smiled. They still stood close for the cameras. But once the doors closed, the distance returned, measured and consistent. I noticed it in the corridor moments that never make the news. William would pause beside a doorway, listening for the right cue to move forward. Harry would step into the same moment and then stop, not because he was unsure, but because the atmosphere had tightened. The room had rules, and William had started to follow them instinctively. Harry saw that. He did not always challenge it, but he did not pretend not to notice it either. Sometimes he tried to pull William back into familiarity. A remark meant to provoke a grin. A question asked in a casual tone that invited an honest answer. The kind of question brothers ask each other when no one else is supposed to be listening. William did not shut him down. He did something more subtle. He redirected. He shortened the reply. He made it safe for the room. That is the difference most people do not understand. The public assumes conflict looks like confrontation. Inside the palace, conflict often looks like restraint. It looks like a conversation that ends one sentence too early. It looks like a topic that is never returned to. It looks like two brothers choosing different exits, so no one has to acknowledge what is missing. There was also the matter of who spoke for whom. Early on, they spoke directly. If one needed something, he asked the other. Later, requests started moving through aides. Simple details were routed around the relationship, not through it. When that begins, it is not because people are busy. It is because someone has decided that direct contact creates risk. No one ever said to me, "The brothers are no longer close." No one had to. I was there when their shared spaces became scheduled rather than natural. I was there when private greetings turned into polite acknowledgments. I was there when silence stopped feeling temporary and started feeling arranged. The world believes the break happened later, when headlines had a reason to attach a date to it. But for those of us who stood close, the story was already changing long before the public had a name for it. And the most important thing I can tell you is this: it did not start with one argument. It started when one brother began to sound like the crown, and the other brother began to feel that he no longer recognized the voice standing next to him. When the separation became official in the public eye, many assumed something had ended. From where I stood, something had already been gone for a long time. The final distance did not feel like a rupture. It felt like confirmation. The palace adjusted quickly, as it always does. Roles were clarified, schedules simplified, movement streamlined. The system prefers clean lines, even when people do not. What was lost was not unity. Unity can be staged. It can be restored for appearances. What was lost was familiarity, the kind that allows disagreement without consequence, the kind that survives silence without explanation, the kind that belongs to brothers who do not need permission to speak honestly. In the years before the public noticed anything was wrong, that familiarity had already faded. The conversations had become careful. Presence had become conditional. Trust had been replaced by protocol. Both brothers moved on, but in different directions. One remained within the structure, carrying its weight with practiced steadiness. The other stepped away from it, carrying something less visible but heavier. The awareness that once you fall out of alignment, the system does not chase you. It waits to see if you will return. The public still debates who was right. From my position, that question misses the point. This was never about winning an argument or choosing sides. It was about two brothers discovering that the same institution could not hold them both in the same way anymore. History will remember one as the future of the crown, the other as the one who left it behind. Those of us who stood close remember something quieter. We remember the moment when shared space turned into managed distance, when brotherhood became something that had to fit around duty instead of the other way around. The crown endured, as it always does. But the relationship that once made it human did not. And once that is lost, it does not return quietly. By the time the tension became unavoidable, the palace did not see it as a family issue. It saw it as a management problem. From the institution's perspective, the situation was simple. One brother represented continuity. The other represented unpredictability. Neither label was moral. They were logistical. I saw how the system began to close around Prince William almost protectively. His instincts aligned with what the palace needed. He did not resist procedure. He anticipated it. He did not push against tradition. He worked within it, shaping himself to fit the role waiting for him. That made him easier to manage, and in an institution built on permanence, ease becomes authority. Prince Harry experienced the opposite effect. The more he questioned, the more the system adjusted to contain him. Not harshly, not visibly, but through layers of structure that limited spontaneity and narrowed influence. Nothing was forbidden outright. It was simply redirected. When Harry suggested changes, the answer was rarely no. It was later, or under review, or not advisable at this time. Those phrases sound neutral, but repeated often enough, they become a wall. William understood that wall. He knew when to lean into it and when to let it speak for him. Harry pushed against it without meaning to. There were moments when Harry tried to address the distance directly, not with accusations, but with honesty. He asked whether they were still on the same path, whether decisions were being made without conversation, whether the future they were preparing for still included him. William listened, and then he did what the crown trains its heirs to do. He reframed. He spoke about duty rather than emotion, about responsibility rather than feeling, about timing rather than intention. Each answer was reasonable, each one avoided the personal question underneath. That is how the system protects itself. It replaces intimacy with structure. From that point on, their conversations changed entirely. They were no longer brothers speaking freely. They were two individuals occupying different positions within the same machinery. The palace did not force them apart. It did something more effective. It rewarded alignment and managed resistance. William became the steady presence everyone relied on. Harry became the variable everyone prepared for. Once those roles were established, conflict no longer needed to be expressed. It was embedded. I watched as shared decisions disappeared, as private discussions were deemed unnecessary, as the space between them became administratively convenient. The tragedy is that neither brother was wrong. One chose survival within the system. The other chose honesty outside of it. And the system does not forgive divergence, especially when it comes from within the family itself. By the time the public noticed the fracture, the palace had already adjusted. It had moved forward, leaving the relationship behind without ceremony. What remained between the brothers was not anger. It was a quiet understanding that they were no longer protected by the same rules. What the public never saw was how differently the two brothers behaved when no one was watching. In private spaces, William became increasingly contained. His movements were economical, his words chosen with care. Even when he relaxed, it felt deliberate, as though relaxation itself had to fit within certain limits. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was often to close a discussion rather than open one. Harry was the opposite. Away from cameras, he spoke freely. He questioned decisions that others accepted without pause. He noticed changes in tone, in access, in how people shifted their posture depending on who entered the room first. I saw moments when Harry realized something had already been decided without him. Not announced, not explained, simply arranged. He would look toward his brother, expecting acknowledgement, perhaps even recognition of the imbalance. What he received instead was composure. William did not deny what was happening. He simply did not engage with it. That silence carried weight. There were habits that revealed more than any argument could. William reviewed briefing papers alone, often earlier than required, as if preparation itself was a form of protection. Harry skimmed them, then focused on the parts that felt human rather than procedural. He remembered names. He remembered faces. He remembered promises made in passing. The palace noticed that difference. One brother was seen as reliable, the other as unpredictable. Those labels were never spoken directly, but they shaped everything that followed. Invitations, access, information. When both brothers were present, staff adjusted their language, conversations narrowed, humor disappeared. It was easier to manage one at a time. They were not treated unequally, but they were no longer treated the same. There were evenings when they occupied the same building, but never crossed paths. Not by accident. Schedules were arranged with care. Movement was coordinated to avoid friction, not because anyone feared conflict, but because the palace avoids uncertainty above all else. Harry felt that avoidance keenly. He began to observe, rather than participate, to measure what he was no longer part of. When he did speak, it was often after a pause, as if deciding whether the effort was still worth it. William, meanwhile, became increasingly fluent in restraint. He knew when to stop a conversation before it became personal. He knew how to leave a room without creating tension. These are not instincts one is born with. They are learned through proximity to power. And once learned, they change how a person relates to everyone, including family. The public assumes distance comes from disagreement. What I witnessed was something quieter and more unsettling. A gradual realization that the same space no longer meant the same thing to both of them. By then, the brothers were no longer moving toward the same future. They were simply moving carefully around each other. And that is when the conflict truly began. Not as an argument, but as an absence. The public believes the conflict between Prince William and Prince Harry was emotional, that it was driven by jealousy, resentment, or influence from outside the family. It is a simple explanation, and simple explanations travel well. Inside the palace, the situation was never described that way. What most people misunderstand is that the divide did not begin with disagreement. It began with acceptance. William accepted something Harry could not, and once that happened, the balance between them quietly shifted. William began to speak the language of the institution without effort, not because he was coached, but because it came naturally to him. He learned which questions did not need answers, which details were better left untouched, which conversations ended not when the truth was reached, but when stability was preserved. Harry noticed the change almost immediately. There were moments when Harry asked questions that felt reasonable to anyone outside the palace. Why a decision had been delayed, why a plan had been altered without explanation, why something promised quietly had disappeared from the schedule. These were not confrontations. They were inquiries. William rarely answered them directly. Instead, he responded with phrases that belonged to the system rather than the family. "We will see. It is being handled. That is not for us to decide." Each response was calm, measured, and correct, and each one placed a little more distance between them. The public saw William growing into his role. Inside, we saw him growing into the crown. Harry felt the change as a loss, not of power, but of access. He was no longer speaking to his brother as an equal participant in private thought. He was speaking to someone who had begun to represent continuity above connection. That distinction matters more than people realize. Staff adjusted accordingly. When William entered a room, decisions aligned themselves around him. When Harry entered, explanations followed. Not because one was favored and the other was not, but because one had already internalized the rules. The palace rewards predictability. William offered it effortlessly. Harry resisted it instinctively. To the public, this difference was framed as responsibility versus rebellion. Inside, it was understood as alignment versus discomfort. One brother found safety in the structure. The other felt constrained by it. They were not arguing about what they wanted. They were reacting differently to what was expected of them. That is why the silence came first. Conversation became careful. Shared opinions became rare. Eventually, it became easier for both of them to speak through intermediaries than to risk exposing the gap directly. The public thinks the conflict erupted suddenly. What they missed was the slow recalibration that made the eruption inevitable. By the time voices were raised in private, the relationship had already been reshaped by years of quiet adjustment. And once that happens, no amount of brotherly affection can undo what the system has already decided.